Hi, folks. Welcome. Thank you all so much for joining this evening to talk about amphibians. And it's also my favorite time of year. It's a time of a lot of change in our forests, change that a lot of people see every day with the snow melting, with birds returning. But this is a big change that's happening that often goes unnoticed unless you happen to stumble upon it on a warm, rainy night, which is the amazing amphibian migration. You know, we know the spring migration of birds, but the spring amphibian migration um, is this amazing, huge event that's happening sometimes through our backyards and certainly across roads near us, and we may not even notice it. So my name is Zach Cota. I'm a teacher naturalist at North Branch Nature Center. And we're going to spend our time together this evening talking about the lives of these animals, talking about where they live, their migration, and then where they're breeding. And then we're also going to talk about ways that you can help these amphibians through one of our community science efforts. So we're going to frame this learning around amphibians with three main characters. So the first character we're going to talk about is the spotted salamander. This is one that a lot of folks know, but maybe not as many have seen it, and particularly not up close. And the reason for that is most of the time the spotted salamander is living underground, which is that word fossorial that you see. And when it does come above ground, it's usually at night. So it's also nocturnal. So most of the time it's underneath our feet. We don't notice it, but we are getting to a time of the year where lots of these animals are going to be coming up from underneath the ground and they're going to be migrating over land. So this is perhaps the best time of year to get to see spotted salamanders. They can be from like 6 to 8 inches long, so about the size of a Snickers bar. They have this really dark gray, sort of in between gray and brown body, really chunky body with these thick legs, and these beautiful bright yellow spots. Sometimes the spots on the head can even take on an orange hue. And those spots are really cool because they are unique to each individual spotted salamander. And you can actually map out the spots and tell one from the other. And at some road crossing sites, they've photographed individual spotted salamanders and been able to see some from season to season. In fact, in one place in New Hampshire, they found the same spotted salamander migrating across this road 5 years in a row, which is really cool. When they're underground, they're usually eating things like worms and beetles. And at night, they'll come and they'll forage underneath the leaves in the forest floor, looking for other invertebrates. And they're a really common salamander. They're found in almost every community in Vermont, probably are indeed in every town in Vermont. But like I said, they're hard to find for most of the year, and they are extremely cute. The other character we'll talk about is the wood frog. Now, this is one of our more common frogs in Vermont. In fact, like the spotted salamander, it's probably found in every single town in the state. But it's pretty small, about the size of a Reese's peanut butter cup. And you can see by the colors on it that it blends in really well on the forest floor. It's this sort of tan brown overall. It has these two ridges. They're called dorsolateral ridges that run down the back. And so that kind of looks like the stem of a leaf, and helps them blend in. And they also have this sort of darker mask. Now, in the springtime, when you see some of these, they can almost take on a pinkish color, a reddish pinkish color during the breeding season. And the females can be pretty big when they have eggs, so they can be pretty good size. And just like the spotted salamander, they're living in deciduous forests, so forest with a lot of shade from leafy trees, and they're eating invertebrates on the forest floor. The last character we're going to focus on is the four-toed salamander. So this is one that is not found in very many communities in Vermont. It's pretty much restricted to the Champlain Valley and a few areas of the Connecticut River Valley. And that's because the four-toed salamander really loves forested wetlands. They are a specialist here in Vermont. And one of the reasons why they're specialized, we'll talk a little bit later, is the way that they breed and lay their eggs. So they're really restricted to these specific wetlands. They have this beautiful coloration on their back. So when you look down at one on its back, it has these ranges from these gray colors to these rusty reds. And it has this almost carved looking pattern on its back, really intricate pattern on its back. But if you were to flip over a four-toed salamander, you'll see that it has a bright white belly with bold dark spots. And we'll talk about the function that has a little later on. Just like the other amphibians, this is eating small invertebrates, so beetles and worms and ants on the forest floor. And here in Vermont, it's listed as a species of greatest conservation need. So this is one of the amphibians that we love to know more about in Vermont so that we can make sure it's protected. And it really is a beautiful little salamander. You'll notice on this four-toed salamander, if you look closely at the picture, there's a little pinch point at the base of its tail where the tail meets the body. And the four-toed salamander can actually shed its tail when it's stressed by a predator. So if something comes to eat the four-toed salamander, it might might have its tail pulled off, or it can actually shed its tail. It can leave its tail behind, and so the tail will wriggle and look like a worm on the forest floor, and that gives the predator a meal. And while the predator is eating the tail, the salamander can find cover and escape. And they do regrow their tails. It takes a little bit of time. And so sometimes this salamander or two of the other salamanders that we occasionally see at road crossings, one being the eastern red-backed salamander, they will regrow that tail if it does come off. And for a little while, it'll look just like a little nub at the end of their body. So a really amazing adaptation this animal has for surviving in our forests. And it also is a reason why we need to be very gentle with these creatures, especially when we're helping them across the road. So where do they live most of the time? Well, like I said, for the spotted salamander, most of the time they're underground in forests a lot like this one. Anywhere you see big leafy trees, and they're underground in rodent burrows and root channels. And at night, they're coming out, particularly on wet nights, to look for food. And like all amphibians, their skin absorbs water and other things, so they have to stay wet. Unlike reptiles that have scales over their body, their bodies will dry out if they're not kept moist. So we only really see these animals coming out on really wet nights. And even though it has those bright yellow spots, you can see the spotted salamander can blend in fairly well on the forest floor. The wood frog is also living in these wooded forests, these leafy forests, because it's blending in really well with those fallen leaves. And it is hard to see. You might even see a wood frog jump, but trying finding where it ends up is a really tricky thing amongst the leaves. And there you can see just how well it blends in and just how well those ridges on its back almost look like the stem of a leaf. Now, the four-toed salamander is a little bit harder to find. It's living mainly in those forested wetlands. It likes sort of more acidic areas and acidic wetlands. And in the winter time, it's spending the time kind of in the upland forests. There's another one of those beautiful, you can tell this is a really wet forest. You can see all those ferns on the forest floor. There's another example, fairly dark too. And that's where the four-toed salamander loves to live. Now, it's not easy to be an amphibian. There are a lot of things that are looking to eat a really good snack. So snakes certainly take a share of amphibians, but also mammals like raccoons and opossums. And oftentimes we see those predators at road crossing sites, particularly areas where there are a lot of amphibians crossing the road at one time. It's not unusual to see an opossum or a raccoon out there, or even an owl swooping down along the roadside um, to eat some of these amphibians as they're on the move. And owls, um, a, a few different owls in particular, one, the eastern screech owl, prefers to nest near vernal pools and other places where these amphibians are breeding, because those owls have timed um, their nesting cycles so that their young are needing food and have hatched just about the time these amphibians are returning to breeding. So those amphibians are concentrated, and you might see owls nearby eating them. Now, in the wintertime, it's hard to be an amphibian. You don't have fur like a mammal, and you can't migrate like a bird does. So you have to simply find a way to survive and almost succumb to the winter. And so the spotted salamander gets through the winter by going underground. It uses those rodent tunnels that it lives in most of the year and goes even further down underground below the frost line where it can survive. The four-toed salamander also goes deep underground, but it prefers to use things like um, rocks and ledgy areas to find places deep underground to spend the winter. The wood frog, though, has a really amazing adaptation. So the wood frog isn't escaping winter, it's really succumbing to it. When it gets cold in the fall, the wood frog is just burying itself right underneath the leaf litter. It's not really going underground at all. It's still on top of the ground, but underneath the leaves. And its body starts producing these chemicals. In all the fluid of its body, it creates glucose, the sugar that helps keep those fluids from freezing solid. And then inside of its cells, it creates these very special proteins that cause the water inside of its cells to freeze in a very specific pattern, so that when that water thaws again in the spring, it doesn't puncture the cells and break them. So this wood frog and several other frogs are actually going to freeze solid. They're going to sit there on the forest floor. They're going to slow their breathing down. Their heart is going to slow down and eventually come to a standstill. The water in their cells will freeze. The sugar inside their blood and other fluids will help keep that from freezing solid. But essentially, these wood frogs are going to be a frogsicle on the forest floor. They're going to look frozen, they're going to feel frozen, but when the spring comes and the snow above those leaves thaws out, so will thaw the wood frog, and it will start to defrost in a very controlled way. And those proteins will allow that water to thaw inside of its cells, and eventually its heart will start beating again. It will start breathing again, and within a little bit, it'll be hopping around the forest floor, and it will be hopping its way to a vernal pool. Now, in the spring, these animals know that it's time to get on the move because of changes that we're seeing right now. So as the snow starts to melt on warm, sunny days, the temperature of the soil gets a little bit warmer. The snow that's melting goes down through the ground, so they're feeling that melting snowpack. And they're also sensing that the air temperature is warmer. And then those first spring rains where water is really soaking into the ground, that tells these amphibians it's really time to move. Now, they're moving to sites to breed. Sometimes that might be a big swamp. Sometimes that might be as small as a vernal pool, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a bit. But these amphibians are going sometimes a long ways to get there. Spotted salamanders can go more than a quarter mile through really dense forests, across fields, and over roads to get to the sites where they're breeding. And it's an event that happens really quickly. So this study looked at a particular vernal pool, and they looked at all the individual salamanders that came back to this vernal pool in spring. And they found that 90% of the salamanders in the vernal pool got there in a span of just 5 days. So within 5 days, all of these salamanders that had been way out in the forest underground made it back to the same pool. So it's a pretty quick event. Now, they're migrating to these pools, but that pool or wetland might not be right next to the forest. In fact, in a lot of places, there are now roads that go in between the place where the salamanders need to lay their eggs and the place where they've spent the winter up and in the forest. And you can see that here, there is a wetland in the foreground, but in the background, there's some forest and there's a road in between. So ideally, they're living in a place like this where there's a beautiful wetland and there is a forest uphill from that wetland where they can spend the winter. But all too often, we've put roads in the way. And so there are some hazards to migrating, which I'm going to show you. And some folks might not want to look at these pictures of dead salamanders who have not made it all the way. But this is unfortunately what happens. Either a predator eats them, like the photo on the left, which is part of nature. But what's not part of nature is when these amphibians are getting hit by cars, which is the photo on the upper right. Now, even though there might be hundreds or thousands of amphibians crossing a road, as little as 1 in 10 of those amphibians being killed in a given year can lead to the loss of that population over time. So just that 10% decline every year can have a pretty significant effect. And so that's what we're seeing in some places where there is a big breeding site and a lot of traffic. So where are these amphibians going? Well, often they're going to places called vernal pools. Vernal pools are these really amazing features on our landscape that are created in these small depressions in a forest. So you may be walking through the forest and notice a place where there's a little dip in the land. Most of the year, that dip might not mean anything or look any different than the forest around it. But as the snow melts in the spring and those first rains come, that little depression forms a pool, essentially a big puddle in the middle of the forest. And that is a great place for these amphibians to lay their eggs. One of the things that makes it a really great place is that it has a lot of food. All of the creatures living in the forest floor, living in the leaf litter, kind of spring to life in a vernal pool. So there's lots of stuff for them to eat. But because the vernal pool dries out, it also means that fish cannot survive there. So there aren't fish predators that are going to eat these amphibians. So not all vernal pools dry out every year. Some might only dry out in really dry years. But many of them will last for a few months at least. They need to last long enough for the amphibians to go through their life cycle. So this time of year, it might look like the picture all the way on the left, where you see a lot of snow still on the ground, ice still covering the pool, but some open water is starting to show up on that vernal pool. And even at that stage, there might be amphibians returning. There might be a few early blue spotted salamanders or wood frogs that are getting back into that vernal pool, even when it's covered with ice. Now, that's a big risk. If you're the first one back to the vernal pool, it might mean that you find a mate really early and you get to breed and lay eggs really quickly. But it also might mean that the pool freezes up again and you might freeze up with it. But looking to the right, that next photo where you're seeing a lot of leaves on the edge of the vernal pool, there's still some snow, but a lot more water. That's definitely the stage in which most of these amphibians are coming back. Spotted salamanders are coming back into that pool. Wood frogs and spring peepers might be coming back into that pool. And then working your way to the right, you can see further into the spring, that pool is going to fill up with water as it rains. But throughout the summer, it's going to dry up. And by the end of that summer, that vernal pool may disappear entirely. There may be no water left. And the amphibians by then will have laid their eggs. The eggs will have hatched. The young amphibians will have grown up eating all of the invertebrates in that vernal pool, and they will have gone back out into the forest after they have grown to adulthood. And that is all taking place, that whole life cycle is taking place before the end of the summer when those vernal pools dry up and disappear. And so the vernal pool is this entire ecosystem contained within essentially a puddle within our forest. And it's an ecosystem that comes and goes every year. It's a pretty important place for these amphibians. The spotted salamander, when it gets there, the males are going to compete for females to breed. And so the males do some amazing things. They'll court the female spotted salamanders by dancing for them in the water. They actually do this little dance. And then the males will swim down to the bottom of the pool where they will lay a little white sperm packet on the bottom of the pool. Then once a male has the attention of a female, he'll guide her down to the sperm packet that he laid. And if she likes his dance moves, she might pick that sperm packet up and use it to fertilize her eggs. And then she's going to lay a big clump of about 100 eggs, maybe a little bit more. And her eggs are going to be coated with this thick sort of jelly sac around it that protects it as the eggs are developing. Then those eggs will hatch and there'll be larval salamanders that are looking for stuff to eat in that vernal pool. And you can see in this picture, there are a lot of salamanders gathered together in even a small vernal pool, perhaps the size of, a normal school classroom. You are going to have hundreds or even thousands of spotted salamanders. And at night, they're all going to be dancing. And they're all going to be courting each other. And on the bottom, you can see those white sperm packets that the male salamanders have put down there. Now, the wood frogs are also using these vernal pools. They're getting back there really quickly. They don't have to come up from underground. Remember, they're just underneath the leaves. So all they need to do is thaw out and start hopping to get to the vernal pool. They're one of the first frogs we hear calling in the spring. And in fact, they sound almost like a duck quacking. And it can be very loud, particularly at night. If you go to one of these breeding pools, you can hear lots of wood frogs calling. They're what's called explosive breeders, which means that this process is taking place really quickly. Within a couple days, these wood frogs are all arriving back at the pool. They're breeding, they're laying their eggs, and then the adults might linger in the vernal pool for a little bit, or they might head right back out into the forest once the eggs are laid. And the females are laying masses sometimes of 700 eggs, which sounds huge for a frog that's only this big, only the size of a Reese's cup. But inside the frog, it's actually tiny. Those eggs are compressed. And so when the eggs are laid, the egg mass is only about the size of a quarter. And what happens is once she lays that egg mass in the water, it's going to absorb the water and it's going to swell up to be about the size of a softball. And because they're all doing this at the same time in the same place, you can see these giant floating masses of these giant floating mats of egg masses that have all been laid together. So you might have one female that lays a softball size mass of eggs, and all the females clump together onto it so that you'll get hundreds of egg masses representing hundreds of thousands of eggs in this big raft on top of the vernal pool, which is a pretty amazing sight to see. Now, the four-toed salamander is doing things a little bit differently. It's nesting in permanent wetlands, but it needs wetlands that are fish-free. So it's finding these little pools that are kind of tucked off to the side that fish can't get to. Now, it needs sphagnum moss to lay its eggs, and it's going to look for a log or a downed tree that is going over the top or right next to that pool. And if that log is covered with moss, the four-toed salamander is going to find its way underneath that moss, and it's going to lay its eggs in that wet moss. And the eggs are going to develop there. And then when they're ready to hatch, those four-toed salamander larvae are going to hatch out of their eggs, and they're going to wriggle out through the moss, and they're going to drop into the water below. And these four-toed salamanders aren't laying nearly as many eggs as the spotted salamanders are. And so what they might do to protect their eggs are lay a bunch of eggs together. So you might get 3 or 4 female four-toed salamanders that lay their eggs together in a group. And then a female or more than one female will guard those eggs while they're developing until they hatch. And that's one of the reasons it has that beautiful color on the underside. You'll note that the top of the four-toed salamander is really made for camouflage. It blends in really well. But if you were to peel back the moss next at a breeding site and see the eggs underneath, that female that's guarding it might flip over to show her bright white belly with all those dark spots to try and confuse or even scare off a predator. So she's going to guard those eggs until they hatch. And then once they hatch and drop into the pool, she can leave them to develop and find their way there. Now, because vernal pools are such a really important feature, but one that's really sensitive to disturbance, Vermont Center for Eco Studies has done a lot of work in protecting them. So if you're really interested in learning more about vernal pools or how to protect them, you can visit the Vermont Center for Eco Studies website, and they do this project called the Vermont Vernal Pool Monitoring Project. They use citizen scientists to go out into the forest and visit these vernal pools to sort of give them a checkup to see what's going on with them. Are they thawing out at the same time every year? Is the water, what changes are there in the water temperature? And we're really worried about vernal pools because as we start to develop more of our landscape, we need to make sure those vernal pools and the areas around them are protected from development. But we're also looking to see what changes happen with climate change. If it's really sunny and hot in the summer, some of these vernal pools, particularly the smaller or the shallower ones, they might dry up before the amphibians have a time to go through their whole life cycle and leave the vernal pool. So that's a concern that we have, and that's one of the things that this project is seeing is how do the vernal pools change, particularly with climate change. So here's another project that you can participate in. And the Vermont Center for Eco Studies and Vermont Fish and Wildlife have done an amazing job of mapping out all of the vernal pools in Vermont. They looked at imagery to try and predict where these vernal pools might be. And so you'll notice on this map, there are quite a few that are confirmed, but there are even more that are potential. So they might have seen a place on a map that looks like it could be a vernal pool, but they need volunteers to go check that spot to see if there is indeed a vernal pool. And if there is a vernal pool there, it can be protected. So here's another citizen science project that you can do through Vermont Center for Eco Studies to protect amphibians. Now, the project that we coordinate here at North Branch Nature Center, we call the Amphibian Road Crossing Program. And when we designed this program, we came up with 3 goals to guide our work with our community scientists. And the first is to just get people excited about amphibians. And we hope that because you are all here tonight, that you are all really excited about amphibians. The second goal is to help them get across the road safely, to stop amphibians from getting hit by cars. And so that's something that you can help us do as a volunteer. But the third piece of our goal is to collect data that transportation planners can use to design better roads that work for amphibians. And so that's one of the other things that you'll do as a volunteer, is not just help the amphibians get across the road safely, but record data about them that we can use and planners can use to help make changes. And those changes can take a couple different forms. So on the left, you can see a road that they've actually closed and had a detour on during a really busy migration season. So there might be an area where there are lots of amphibians crossing the road and the potential for them to be hit by cars. And so they might detour traffic on nights where there are going to be a big migration. So those kind of really warm, rainy nights in early spring. And then on the right, you can see where they're actually putting in an underpass. They're putting in a way for the amphibians to go underneath the road, so they won't have to cross it at all to get to where they need to lay their eggs. And this is a sort of project that's happened here in Vermont. So this is in the town of Moncton, Vermont, and there was a spot that was a perfect place for amphibians to breed. There was a big, beautiful wetland. There is a big, beautiful wetland. And up the hill from the wetland is this beautiful forested hillside, just the right place for the amphibians to spend the winter. But each fall or each spring, as the amphibians were migrating down to get to the wetland to lay their eggs, they were having to cross a really busy road, and lots of them were getting hit by cars. And so a few partners, the Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas, and then also some local conservation groups got together to get grant funding to help build this beautiful underpass. So you'll notice that there is a path, a little concrete passage that goes underneath the road, and that allows the amphibians to get from one place to the other. And then there are concrete blocks that go along the edge there, and those blocks direct the amphibians into that underpass. And at either end of those concrete blocks, there's even a little turnaround that if the amphibians get going the wrong way, it points them back toward that underpass. And they are amazing, and hundreds of amphibians, even thousands of amphibians, are using this every night. And there are some great videos of them hopping and crawling through that space. And so this is a program that we're really hoping you get involved in, because we need you to go out and help these animals get across the road safely. And we need you to get data so we can build more underpasses and other infrastructure to help these animals. So the way this program works is you'll attend a training like this and read our volunteer manual, which is on our website. And then you'll look on the map to see where there are crossing sites near you. So on the map on our website, you'll be able to look all throughout Vermont and see where we've identified, with the help of volunteers, different amphibian crossings. Now, some of these, the ones in green, have been visited multiple times by volunteers, and we know there are amphibians crossing the road there. Other ones, the yellow sites, you'll note that 5 or fewer volunteer visits have been made to that site. So we might know that there are amphibians crossing the road there, but we don't know, we don't have a lot of data on that site. And then the red, you'll notice that have been no volunteers at that site. So we really don't know if there are actually amphibians crossing the road. We think there might be because maybe there's a wetland on one side and a forest on the other side. But we need you to go out there and check. And so once you've found a site on the map, you'll zoom in to look at that site and notice that there's a stretch of road that will be highlighted. And that's the transect where we want you to survey. So what you'll do, and there on that picture, you can see that little pink line. And so that's the area we are asking you to walk and check for amphibians. And so once you've identified your site, you're going to go out there on these nights when amphibians are moving. So these first nights of early spring, when it is at least 32 degrees, so warm enough to rain rather than snow or sleet. And if it has been raining, or if it currently is raining and the ground is moist. Remember that these amphibians, they don't have scales like reptiles, so they have to have really wet conditions in order to keep their bodies moist. So if there's a time, there's an evening where it's been raining or it currently is raining, it's warm enough to rain, so at least 32 degrees. And just after the sun goes down, or a little bit later in the evening, we're asking you folks to go out to these sites. What you'll do is you'll walk from one end of that transect line to the other. And as you go, you'll write down information on the road conditions, whether they're wet or dry, how much is it raining, what's the temperature, and then how many cars go by while you do the survey. Then as you go, you'll count the amphibians that you come across, whether they're alive or they're dead. And you'll help the ones that are still trying to get across, you can help them get across to the side they're going toward. Then there are a few rare species that I'll talk about in a minute, but if you do see a rare one, we ask that you take a picture of it and send it to us. Once you get from one side to the other of that pink line, you'll stop and then flip your data sheet over and record a whole new set of data for your walk back. And that's one survey when you've gone out and back and tallied all the amphibians you see and then help the ones that need it across the road. I want to talk for a little bit about the different animals you might see at a crossing site. So one of the ones we see sometimes is the eastern red-backed salamander. Now, this animal is not headed to a vernal pool. In fact, they lay their eggs inside rotting logs right in the forest. They're a forest-dwelling salamander, and they don't go to a wetland to lay their eggs, but on moist nights, they might go wandering around looking for things to eat. So we're less likely to see them at a crossing site, but we want you to know what they look like because they can be confused with the four-toed salamander, which is one we definitely want to know about. This little eastern red-backed salamander is the most abundant terrestrial vertebrate in the eastern forest. They are everywhere. In fact, there can be one in every square meter in the forest. So you are probably not far from this creature anytime you go for a walk through the forest in Vermont. Now here's a salamander that we do see crossing the road, headed to vernal pools. This is the Jefferson salamander. It's a cousin of the spotted salamander. It's about the same size, but instead of that really dark color, that almost black but really dark gray brown color that the spotted salamander has, this is a more lighter chocolatey brown overall. And you'll notice it has some of that sort of blue coloring on the sides. These Jefferson salamanders are a species of special concern in Vermont. And where they are found, we want to know about it because that's an area that needs to be protected. Um, and these are one of the earliest ones to come across at crossing sites in the spring, headed back to vernal pools. Now, the blue spotted salamander is really closely related to the Jefferson salamander. It's a bit smaller, and you'll notice that the color of the blue spotted salamander is much darker. It's almost black overall. And those blue spots on its sides are really bright. It has that really bright blue flecking on the side. Its face is also a bit narrower, and its tail is almost round. And if we go back and look at the Jefferson salamander, you can see it has that really wide face, and its tail is actually almost pushed together, almost sort of compressed, versus the blue spotted salamander has a much more round tail and a much narrower face. Now, the tricky thing is, these two species, the blue spotted salamander and the Jefferson salamander, they can mix their genes together and make hybrids. So in areas where we're seeing both blue spotted and Jefferson salamanders together, we want to look out for ones that look like sort of in between, almost a mix. And if you get one of these that you're not sure of, take a picture and we can help you figure out which is which. One animal we see sometimes at crossing sites, even though it's not trying to get to a vernal pool, it's not making a spring migration like the other salamanders we're talking about, is the eastern newt. Eastern newts are aquatic, meaning they're going to spend all of their adulthood in a permanent water body. You might see them in a pond or in a swamp where they have a sort of olive green color and red spots on their back. But as a young salamander, they're called a red eft. They have this bright orange color, and they're going to spend the first few years of their life actually wandering around on land and maybe finding a new place to spend their adulthood, different from where they were born. And so during this time when they're really moving around, we might happen to see them crossing the road at a crossing site. One of our frogs that we see regularly at road crossings is the American toad. American toads are using different wetlands for breeding, and they'll use all sorts of different areas to lay their eggs. And they're doing that a lot later in the season. So where we may see some of these early frogs and salamanders, we might start seeing wood frogs and blue spotted salamanders moving around, say in March, if the conditions are right. The American toad might be getting to breeding pools even in June. So the season can be pretty long with a cast of characters that sort of revolves as the season progresses. So American toads are pretty easy to spot. They're a chunky frog. They have these sort of beautiful colors that are sometimes tan or yellow or even rusty orange, but they're covered with spots on their back. And so that's really the telltale sign of an American toad. The spring peeper is the smallest frog we're going to see at a crossing site, and it's so small that you have to keep a sharp lookout for them because they are even smaller than my thumb. They can have a body size that is around the size, even smaller than a quarter. Some of the spring peepers we see could fit on a quarter. And they blend in really well. They're this sort of beautiful light brown and tan. And one of the things you'll notice is it has this distinctive dark cross shape on its back. And that's how you know for sure you've got a spring peeper. Now, these peepers are known for their sound, that peep that they make in the spring. And when they get together in a pool, you can hear this very loud chorus of spring peepers. And they're actually crawling up out of the pool onto, say, cattails or other vegetation to call and attract a female. and they can climb up that vegetation because they're actually in the tree frog family. And you'll see if you look really closely at that picture, at the end of each of its toes, it has this little circular disc. It's a sticky pad that helps it climb. And so just so you know, these spring peepers, because they cling really well, they can be hard to handle when you're moving them across the road. They like to jump and they also like to cling to you, which can be fun because sometimes you get a really close encounter with them. But it means we have to be very careful and gentle with these animals as well. Now, we're asking you to go out on a few different rainy nights if you can. That way we can get a sense of what each site looks like. When are the amphibians moving? What different kinds of species are we seeing? And how many are there? Now, after you've collected your data, maybe you've written it all down on your data sheet while you were out there in the field. Back at home, you can put that data into our database by using this online form, which is on our website. You can do it either on a computer, on a desktop app, or on a mobile app on your phone. So you'll just look through your data sheet and put all that information right into our computer. And you'll be able to see on the map how your data shows up. So you can see changes on the map that reflect the data you've submitted. And then that's it. Give yourself a big congratulations because you've helped some amphibians cross the road and you've collected really important data that scientists and conservationists are going to use to help protect amphibians for generations to come. Now, when we're out here doing this project, we need to think about our safety and the safety of amphibians. So this means for amphibians that if we're handling amphibians, keep our hands clean. One of the things that we've been doing a lot of lately are using hand sanitizer. So alcohol hand sanitizer to keep our hands clean so we're not spreading germs. Unfortunately, that alcohol hand sanitizer can be really bad for the amphibians. So if we are going to use that, you'll want to wash your hands off really well before you start handling amphibians. And you'll also want to make sure you don't have anything else on your hands, any lotions, anything like that, because the amphibians will absorb those. And really, we're only handling these creatures if it's necessary. So if you're on a road that's not very busy and you see a salamander crossing the road and it's almost all the way across, you might just watch it if there's no traffic coming and let it cross safely by itself. But if you're on a busy road and you see lots of amphibians and frogs about to cross the road, you can pick them up and hold them until it's safe to walk across the road yourself and get them across. I usually bring a bucket with me that I can put a frog or a salamander in and let it sit there while I wait for traffic to be clear and then bring it across. And sometimes you might even put your bucket, have a few different salamanders or frogs in your bucket while you're waiting for a break in the traffic to bring them across the road. The other thing, we'll want to be really gentle with these amphibians. We won't want to hold them tightly or squeeze them because we don't want to stress them out or injure them. So we have to practice being really gentle. Now, to keep us safe, we want to make sure that people see us. We're only going out when it's dark because that's when the amphibians are moving. And we're only going out when the roads are wet and probably when it's raining at least a little bit. So we'll need to make sure that we have all the clothes we need to stay warm and dry. So our thermal layers and our rain layers on, as well as waterproof boots. But we'll want to make sure we have some reflective material. So a reflective safety vest on top of our rain gear. And then when I go out, I usually use a headlamp so that I can see where I'm going and so that cars can see me. And then I use a separate spotlight or a flashlight that I can use to actually scan and look for the amphibians. A couple other things that is nice to have, I mentioned the bucket. You'll also need a clipboard and your data sheet in order to jot down what you see. Sometimes it's handy to put that data sheet with a sheet of plastic over it to help prevent the rain from soaking it all the way through. Or you can buy Write in the Rain paper and print your data sheet on that. And you'll want to make sure you bring with you, we recommend either a camera or a smartphone just in case you come across an amphibian that you don't recognize. So you can take a picture of it and send it to us, or you might just want to share your experiences. And we love seeing photos of people helping amphibians across the road and doing that safely. And then one other thing that helps with our survey efforts is to have a spatula, not one from your house and not one that you plan to cook with ever again. What you'll do with the spatula is pick up the amphibians that are dead in the road and move them off of the side of the road. Now, this helps us when we're doing the survey to be able to not count the dead amphibians when we're doing our next survey on the way back, but it also protects the things that are going to eat those dead amphibians. So animals like opossums and raccoons and owls, those animals are going to go out into the road to eat the dead amphibians for a snack. And when they're in the road, there's a chance that those animals could be hit by a car as well. So we're helping with our survey when we move those dead amphibians off the road, but we're also helping nature's cleanup crew, those scavengers, and protecting them. So when I do move dead amphibians off the road, I usually move them at least a meter or so off the shoulder of the road. That way, if an owl does come get a snack, it's safely out of traffic. Now, how have we done so far with this project? We launched this project 4 years ago now, and in 2018, we had 35 different sites. Now we have well over 100. We might have close to 200 sites that we've identified throughout Vermont with the help of partners. That was in 2018, there were 19 towns and 4 counties. We had 46 volunteers, and they put in 179 hours counting amphibians, counting 3,330 amphibians getting across the road. And it's pretty amazing. In Waterbury, we've had a team, 3 generations of amazing women, community scientists helping amphibians crossing the road. We partnered with a team from the Stowe Land Trust. Their staff went out to survey a site that was adjacent to one of their conserved properties, and they helped 171 amphibians get across the road in less than an hour and a half. And there's another example of a volunteer surveying site in Cabot who realized that while doing road construction, crews had erected a drift fence, so a plastic fence along the road. And it was on the side of the road that the vernal pool was on. And so the amphibians were crossing the road, hitting this fence, and then having to turn around and go back across the road and risk getting hit again. And we were able to coordinate with VTrans to get that fence removed for the breeding season, and so that the animals could get across really safely. So now what happens? Well, we want you folks to all sign up to help with our project. So on our web page, you can sign up. There's a button to press to become an amphibian road crossing volunteer. And that will sign you up for our email group, where we'll let you know what's happening with the project. And we might give you a guess about when it might be really good conditions to go out and look, particularly here in central Vermont. You'll go out on your rainy nights and you know, hopefully share with us what you see and what you learn out there at your sites. And so with that, I'll say thank you all so much for being here tonight, for being interested in amphibians and learning about their lives, and for being interested in helping them by becoming a community science volunteer. And I think now what we'll do is, Sean has been keeping track of any questions that might be on on the chat. So if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and Sean will ask me what you've all asked him.
Yeah, thanks so much, Zach. I'll ask a couple of questions. And in the background here, I'm going to queue up the website. I would love to take a moment to orient folks to the website. I know many of you have questions about the protocol still, about exactly what's on that data sheet, where's that manual, that kind of thing. So we'll do a couple of questions here, and then I'll introduce you to the things on the website that you should know about. But some great questions. I think Haley asked, how do we actually identify the road crossing sites?
How do the people at North Branch, how did we figure out where these are?
Yep.
Sometimes it was looking at, sometimes they were suggestions from volunteers. So when Sean shows you our Amphibian webpage, there's an actual button you can press to say, I found a new crossing site that's not on the map. So some of these sites come from volunteers getting out and finding them. Some of these have come from looking at places like iNaturalist. So I went through iNaturalist. I looked at every single submission of an amphibian in Vermont throughout the years, and noticed when there was a picture of an amphibian crossing a road. And then I looked at that spot and said, is this a potential place for a crossing? And some of them turned out to be perfect habitat, where there was a beautiful forest on one side of the road and a wetland on the other. In other places, we're working with community partners. So we started this project really focused on central Vermont, right around the nature center. But what we've done is now engage communities across Vermont, conservation commissions, local land trusts, watershed associations, and scaling up this project and bringing it to other areas. And those organizations that know their communities are helping us identify crossing sites and putting them up on our map. So this year, we're really excited to have a Mad River Valley salamander team that's focused on those 4 communities in partnership with the Friends of Mad River. We're excited to have a team up in the Missisquoi River Basin, and we're excited to have a team in the Upper Valley in partnership with the Hartford Conservation Commission.
That actually dovetails really nicely with another question also of Haley's, which is how do we actually get information out to road crews, to municipalities, and what's that partnership look like between us and conservation organizations?
Yeah, the partnership works best when we have community partners that are engaged in connecting with volunteers. And when we have these community conservation partners, that's what we call them, these local conservation commissions and land trusts, at the end of the season, we provide them a report that tells them what happened in their town in this season. So it'll show all the sites where we've identified sites. It'll tell what the volunteers found, and then we'll give them some suggestions based on what volunteers found and what they can do to help protect the amphibians at those sites. But in other areas, we don't have relationships right now with local transportation planners, but we'd love to really develop those, because that's what we're hoping with this project, is that we can make some long-term changes to our roads to make them safer for amphibians.
Thanks. So let's see. I'm asking these a little bit out of order for a reason, but Sarah's wondering, is it better to pick up amphibians while wearing gloves?
So yeah, that's a great question. I prefer not to wear gloves. I make sure my hands are really, really clean and I don't have any chemicals or anything on them. But you certainly can wear gloves. We recommend wearing nitrile gloves, so non-latex gloves. And if you are wearing gloves, make sure they're not powdered. So you can get powdered gloves, which are really nice because they slip on and off really easily, but that powder can be absorbed by the amphibian. So as long as they're non-powdered, non-latex gloves, those will work. You can also wear just work gloves as well. So if you have some thinner work gloves, that can be good too. Just make sure you weren't doing anything like handling any chemicals with those work gloves.
Great. Ezra is asking a question that I'll go ahead and answer, which is, when should we go outside and actually look for these amphibians? And Zach gave some good guidelines, but our mantra around here is when it's dark, when it's raining, or at least it was recently raining, and when it's at least 32 or 40 degrees. So Zach has been saying 32 degrees. If it's above freezing, they could be moving. But usually things don't really get going until it's like above 40 degrees or pushing 40 or above. So if you're out there with your family, looking for more of a sure thing, looking for some larger movement, if it's hovering around 32 degrees, there's not going to be a whole lot moving. But if it's 40 or above, there's going to be movement. Anything you want to add to that, Zach?
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are some hardy amphibians out there. The other factor is how much snow is on the ground. So some amphibians will move over the snow. I've seen wood frogs hopping over snow, but the woods can't be full of snow. So that's the other thing. There has to be some snow melt. But already here in Vermont, we've had a couple movements. In fact, down in the southern Champlain Valley, where the snow melts pretty early, there have already been blue spotted salamanders on the move. And those salamanders, Jim Andrews found actually using a waterway, using kind of the wet edge of a stream that was a bit warmer than the snowy areas around it to migrate down to the wetland. So there's already been some movement, but that movement is going to be really based on where the site is. If it's a site in the southern Champlain Valley where it warms up and the snow melts pretty quickly in the spring, it might be time right now. The next rainy night, there might be movement there. But if you live in the Northeast Kingdom and you still have 2 feet of snow, don't expect to see any amphibians quite yet.
And on that same note, folks often expect us to put out a prediction as to when movement's going to be good. And that's very difficult for us to do on our end because conditions can vary so dramatically across the state. And so rather than relying on us for a prediction, just remember those simple conditions. You know, is there snow? Is it above 40? Is it raining? Is it dark? And is it early spring? That, you know, late March to through April period. And so you can make that prediction yourself, and you can make it pretty reliably. We'll make predictions the best that we can, but it is hard when we have folks all over the state.
And unfortunately, sometimes what happens is, and we had a season like this 2 seasons ago, where we didn't have much rain in the early evening. Oftentimes we were getting these rainstorms that came in at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and it had been dry up until then. And so the amphibians were moving in the wee hours of the morning. Now, if it starts raining at 2 a.m. on a warm night in early spring, and you want to get up and go survey, you might be rewarded to an amazing migration experience. But getting up at 2 a.m. to see salamanders is not everyone's jive. So just know that there might be big nights that really happen at odd hours of the early morning.
There's a lot of really great questions coming in, and we'll do our best to get to them all. I want to address Jan and Richard's question. They're saying, once a party of volunteers has completed their round trip walk up and down the roadway, is it okay to take 1 or 2 more round trips to help additional amphibians? The short answer is yes, you can absolutely be out there all night if you would like to. We want to clarify that in order for this data to be useful from a scientific perspective, it's really important that you submit the data to us according to the protocols. And so what that means is when you're walking, let's say, from your car out to the other side of your transect, that is one pass. When you've gotten to once you're at the farthest end and you're on your return trip, switch over, get a fresh data sheet, and collect a new set of information for the way back to the car. And if you're going to keep going back and forth, you can choose to do a 3rd data sheet, a 4th data sheet, whatever. If you get sick of collecting data and you just want to rescue amphibians, that's fine. You know, after your first couple of passes, but it's really important that each data sheet represent a one-way transect. And on our website, which I'll pop over to in just a moment, you'll see that the physical data sheet is really a tool for you to be able to keep track of information that you're going to then put into an easy form and hit submit. So if it's easier for you to just write down all the information that you need to collect on a piece of paper or your phone or something like that, and then transcribe that onto the online form later, that's fine. But we provided a data sheet for you to make it easier if you want. Anything else on that topic, Zach, before I switch over to my screen share?
No, I think that's it.
Right, so this is our amphibian conservation website, northbranchnaturecenter.org/amphibian-conservation. And if you're wondering what are the next steps to be able to have everything you need to hit the ground running once our first warm rainy night comes along, this is your place to go to. And so spend some quality time with this, and make sure you read the volunteer manual. This will go into some more detail about exactly what that protocol looks like. We've worked really hard to try to keep it as easy and as simple as possible so that you can spend more of your time enjoying the amphibians and less of your time trying to, collect all sorts of, random bits and pieces of information. So we are always trying to simplify our methodology every year. So check out the manual and protocols before you head out. Watch our training videos, although you're in the training right now, and so you can check that one right off the list. Join our amphibian crossing guard mailing list. So that's, if you want to receive emails from us, you can click this button right up here to join our mailing list. And then pick a survey site, get out and start helping amphibians. And so over here, on this sidebar is really all the resources that you're going to want to have quick access to throughout the season. There's that volunteer manual, which is just a PDF that kind of goes through the instructions. The amphibian crossing map, Zach referenced here. I just want to show you how cool this is. So when you click on any particular site, it will pop up a little spreadsheet for you of how many surveys have been done at that site in the past, how many different species have been seen there, the total number of amphibians that have been spotted at that, the rate that they're crossing at. It'll show you which species have been seen at that crossing, so you can get a sense of what you're likely to find at that road crossing site. So if you're going out with your family and you want some really good success so that your kiddos can have the pleasure of seeing spotted salamanders and wood frogs and whatnot, use this map to your advantage to find a site that's likely to produce. You can also then zoom in on this map and check to see whether that road is paved, whether it's dirt roads. You can get a sense for what traffic is going to look like, and decide for yourself if you're going to be comfortable on that roadway by yourself or with your family. And we also want to re-encourage you to check out these red sites. You'll see there's no information in these red sites. And that's because these are sites that Zach or I or others have identified as potential road crossing sites, but we've never had anybody out there to look and check up on that during a crossing night. So if you're up for an adventure and you want to be the first person to potentially document one of these crossings, you could hit up some of these red sites. Now, when you submit your data, and I'm going to go now back to our homepage, our online data entry portal here. This will bring you to a road crossing form where you can submit, where you put in your name and when your survey started, when you ended, the road conditions, the species that you saw. I'll let you spend some quality time with our data forms. But when you submit that this form, give it a minute or two, but then your data will automatically show up right on the map. So you can see in real time your dot turn from red to yellow to green. So anyway, use this map to help guide your decision making around where you go to. Zach said if you come across a species like a blue spotted salamander or a Jefferson salamander that you're not really quite sure which it is, or if it's a hybrid or anything, if some folks are asking about turtles and other things, if you find anything that you just find interesting or you're not sure about, feel free to submit that photo in this photo submission portal here. So that's the orientation I wanted to give you to our resources. So spend some time with that. And Zach, you want to jump in before I stop sharing here?
Yeah, so just button by button, the top one, click on that so you can get updates about this program. That way we can have your email and information so we know that you're interested in being a volunteer. The button below that, if you do go out and you find a site that we have not mapped, you can click on that button to fill out a form and tell us where that is so we can add it to the map. And then if you scroll down a bit farther, Sean, this is the training. But if you are interested in learning more about amphibians, there are some additional training videos you can watch, particularly if you're like, I can't remember how to identify this amphibian. Parts 3 gives you a lot more detail about what you might see and find when you're out crossing. So there you go. That's it.
There's a really great FAQ that we're adding to all the time with new questions that folks ask us a lot. So check out the FAQ as well. But yeah, spend some quality time with these resources before you head out, and you'll have everything you need to be successful. Jumping back to some other questions here. Let's see. Oh, some folks are asking you, Zach, to put in a plug for your online amphibian course. Would you say a quick word about your online class?
Yeah, so I led a course last spring all about amphibians, amphibian ecology. So it's accessible through our website, and it will guide you through a spring with amphibians, learning about all of the different frogs and salamanders we have in Vermont, how to find them, how to participate in different community science efforts. You'll learn a lot more about their lives, and the efforts being done to conserve amphibians here in Vermont and protect them all around the world. So if you're interested in learning a lot more about our amphibian neighbors, definitely check out that course.
And I just put a link into our chat bar here to everybody with a link to that to all of our online classes. So northbranchnaturecenter.org/nature now. Nature Now are our online course series. Thanks. Let's see. Alan has a great suggestion of also bringing a tape measure or a ruler out with you, so you can take a picture of, just so you can measure things for fun, but also if you're taking a picture, that you can have something in there for a scale reference.
Yeah, that's really, having a ruler or something is really great. If you don't have a ruler, what we suggest is a known quantity. So take a quarter and set it down next to the amphibian. That way, when we look at the picture, we know how big a quarter is and we compare it to the amphibian. So if you don't have a ruler handy, just something that we can measure like a coin is really good.
Do wood frogs sometimes freeze and thaw multiple times?
This is a great question. They do have some tolerance to freeze and thaw multiple times within a season, but it's not, they can't tolerate freezing and thawing over and over and over. And this is one of the reasons why we think one of the frogs that used to live here, the boreal chorus frog, one of the reasons why we think that has declined and actually been extirpated, it doesn't exist in Vermont anymore, is because there's less snow than there used to be. And without that insulating layer of snow keeping them frozen, the chances of them freezing and thawing increased, and they just weren't able to survive that here. So that there's, I think for that species, there's some other factors too, but that was one of them, is having many more freeze thaw cycles, and that has implications when we're talking about climate change. These animals have adapted to really specific, a really specific environment and a really specific seasonal change. And as we alter that, it's really tough for them to adapt.
Somebody's asking if the wood frogs have started their mating season. Well, once they start migrating, they have started the mating season. So once you're out there and things are moving across the roadways, that they're moving because it is the beginning of the mating season. Right now, it's still a little bit early over here in central Vermont, but there's already been considerable movement down in the Champlain Valley.
Yeah, and I was noticing how much the snow, I was noticing this afternoon how much the snow has melted. And I think that puts us right on the cusp of a movement. So I think in some areas, even here in central Vermont, the next night that we get, maybe in the next week where it is warm and raining, we're going to see amphibians on the move.
Thanks. I'm going to jump down to another question below and then pop back to where some of the questions higher up. I just don't want, I want folks to know that I'm not forgetting about you. But an important question for returning volunteers is, in the past, we used to ask folks to adopt a crossing site, and that would be kind of your site for the season. What we found is that it's much more fun for everybody, and actually much easier and productive from a data standpoint for everybody to just go wherever they want to go. So you don't need to adopt a site. You can feel free. If you have a favorite site, by all means, go to it. If you want to try something else, you're welcome to do that as well. Now, if you're out there if you go to your site and you find that there's other parties at the site as well, maybe there's a couple 100 yards out in front of you, just make note of that. There's a place to make a note of that in the data sheet, so that we know that you're not the only people out there. Because theoretically, the people way out in front of you, they might find a frog that you would have found, 5 minutes later or something like that. So anyway, collect data as you would, but just make a note that there are other parties there. Zach, did you want to add anything to that one? Great. Zach, what sounds do frogs make? In particular, let's go with wood frog and spring peeper, since that's what a lot of
I am terrible at frog sounds. If you ask me bird sounds, I might have a better chance. The wood frogs make this kind of almost quack-like duck sound. And they can kind of, when they get all together, it can sound like a whole bunch of ducks. And the spring peepers make a little tiny beep, beep. And they can do this beep kind of rising trill sound too. But both are pretty loud. So if they are breeding nearby, I have a beautiful vernal pool near my home, down the rail trail. And the vernal pool is about a 1/4 mile down this trail. And with my window open at night, I can very clearly hear the spring peepers and the wood frogs as well.
They're deafening too. You'll be out there and you can't see the thing, and it's the spring peeper is a 1/4, like you said, and yet it is absolutely making your ears ring. It's so loud. It's just mind blowing.
Yeah, and one of the things I don't think I pointed out well enough is that we have early migrants, so spring peepers and spotted salamanders and wood frogs that are moving pretty early, so even late March and April. But things like gray tree frogs and American toads are moving much later, so maybe May and June. So even though there's this big push on the front side of these few species, there are going to be species that are migrating even into June. And what can happen is, as you start to see gray tree frogs and American toads migrating toward the breeding site, you might see wood frogs migrating the other way. So they've already done all of their business and they're migrating back up into the forest. So you can get this crossing of early species going away from the breeding site and later species going toward the breeding site. And so the wood frogs might be done just as the toads and the tree frogs are getting started.
And that brings up another good point, which is when you find an amphibian on the roadway, move it in the direction it's already going. Don't assume which direction it's going, because like you said, they could potentially be going both directions, and our goal is to help it along its way and not put it back on the other side of the road so it has to cross again. Let's see. Yeah, Liz is asking, are we interested in turtles crossing? And I'm going to expand that question a little bit and ask, there are certain amphibians that we're not really keeping track of on this project, like leopard frogs and pickerel frogs and things like that. And why is it that we're not really paying a lot of attention to those species? And what about turtles?
Yeah, so we're focused on these species that have migrations that are really affected by roads. So these species that rely on two different habitats. They have a place in the upland forest where they spend the winter and a place in a lowland wetland, either a vernal pool or a swamp. And they have to migrate sometimes significant distances to get there. And when there's a road in the way, there's a problem. So we're focused on the species that make that big migration. Now, other species of amphibians can certainly end up in the road, but things like pickerel frogs are not making these big migrations from one habitat to the other and crossing the road to do so. We certainly, we certainly suggest that you report those other species, something like a pickerel frog or even a snapping turtle. And the place to do that is the Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas. And they take reports of all different reptiles of amphibians. So if you find something that we're not keeping track of on this project, you can add it there. The other place is iNaturalist. So iNaturalist is another community science project that records encounters of any living thing. So if you were to see a barred owl or a raccoon at a crossing site, you could take a picture of it and report it on iNaturalist. So even if it's not one of the species we're focused on, there's a way to report that encounter.
We actually saw a bobcat 2 years ago on one of our survey sites off in the woods. And it's amazing how these migrating amphibians will draw all sorts of things to the area. Let's see, great question about, oh, well, actually, let me just dovetail that point about the Reptile and Amphibian Atlas. Somebody was suggesting, yeah, report things to that aren't collected, that we're not focused on. You can report it to the Vermont Reptile and Amphibian Atlas. There are surprising, the atlas is really about trying to document species at the town level all across the state, figuring out where species have been historically seen, where they're being seen now. And there's some surprising omissions. There's relatively common species that we know are in those towns, but nobody's ever documented it. So it doesn't hurt to check out the Herp Atlas and just see if you live in an area where there just happens to have not ever been, certain species found there. That could be a good chance to document that. I'll also just add another point that at the bottom of our data sheet is a space to actually add on additional species. And so that's where you can add a pickerel frog and let us know that you saw that, or a wood turtle, or a bobcat, or whatever else you find out there that's noteworthy. There's an additional species place to fill in if you find anything like that you want to let us know about. Question about whether it's better to have dry hands or wet hands when you're moving the salamander, Zach.
Oh, you'll definitely want to have wet hands when you're moving frogs and salamanders because they need to stay moist. And if your hands are dry, you can actually suck moisture out of their body. And you can actually, if you ever handle an amphibian, sometimes you can feel them sort of getting this kind of sticky feeling to them, and that's when they're secreting mucus and you're actually drying them out. And so that's a sign that that animal needs to get moisture right away. So I'll either, just hold my hands out in the rain, or, if there's like wet vegetation, grass on the side of the road, maybe bring your hands through that. Just anything you can do to make sure your hands are moist when you're getting ready to handle an amphibian.
Thanks. Clarifying question to Sarah. Does the data we input automatically add to the Reptile and Amphibian Atlas? And no, it does not automatically go to them. If you report it to us and it's particularly interesting, we will report it on your behalf to the Reptile and Amphibian Atlas. If it's something particularly common, we probably won't. But we do work with Jim Andrews and the Atlas just to make sure that we're being as useful as possible in this project to help support the goals of that project as well. All right, let me take one last pass for other questions that we may have missed here. There's a question about, can we make multiple passes on a site? I'll just clarify that again. You can do as many laps at your site as you want to. Just make sure that every time that you go out and every time you come back, you're doing a survey one way and a survey the other way. So if you're submitting your data correctly, you'll always be submitting data in pairs of two, right? You'll be submitting 2 entries at a time, unless you never return back to your car. Let's see. Somebody's asking, are otters predators for frogs?
Yeah, I think otters will definitely eat just about anything they can find. But I think they're more likely to find those frogs once they get to their breeding site, particularly if that's something like a swamp, rather than visiting a roadside to get a snack. But you never know.
And last question, which I think is just an impressive one. What are the lifespans of some of these critters, Zach?
For some of them, it's pretty short. Wood frogs might live a year or 2 or 3 at the most. So wood frogs, there's a pretty high turnover. But spotted salamanders can live a long time. In fact, in captivity, spotted salamanders can live a couple decades. So it really varies. And that's one of the really nice things about spotted salamanders is because of their spots, you can identify individuals. And in the wild, they've been shown to live 8-9 years and at the same place. So returning to the same site for years and years on end. And that's a project that maybe someday we can scale up and do that here. And it's really fun to get to know the salamanders in your neighborhood.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Hope you're getting excited for the amphibian season to begin near you, and hope that you're on the right track for having everything you need to be out there and be successful and save amphibians and contribute data and all the rest. Zach and I are here to help you throughout the season. So if you need anything, if you have any questions that aren't answered by the website, feel free to shoot us an email. Either Zach, Z-A-C, at northbranchnaturecenter.org, or Sean, S-E-A-N, at northbranchnaturecenter.org. If you get an email in our direction, we will get back to you. So good luck, everybody. Take care, and I'll give you the last word, Zach.
We thank you, and the amphibians thank you as well.